Whenever people reach out and ask me for my recommendation on their first RF lens purchase, my answer is always the same, and that is the Canon RF 35mm 1.8 prime lens. Okay, so why the 35mm 1.8, especially since I recently put out a video proclaiming my love for the 50mm 1.8 Nifty 50 prime lens from Canon, which is another great first lens. The RF 35mm 1.8 has a few extra tricks up its sleeve over the Nifty 50 that, in my opinion, makes it a better first lens if you can stretch that budget for most people. For example, the 35mm 1.8 has very strong central sharpness, even when shooting at its widest 1.8 aperture, a fast aperture that will lend itself to shooting portraits, weddings, and shooting in low light situations. 35mm is an easy to use and versatile focal length, well suited to things like travel photography and street photography. And this lens also has macro functionality, which is great for, of course, product photography. And last but not least, this lens has built-in image stabilization as well as a really smooth focus motor, meaning it is great for video too. So let's break each of those points down one by one and start at my favorite place, which is using this lens for portraits. The Canon RF 35mm 1.8 is just an amazing lens for environmental portraiture. I've shot thousands of images with this lens, and despite it being one of the cheaper RF primes, it has never disappointed me, whether using it on the R6 or the high-resolution Canon R5. It has been one of my absolute favourite lenses to use on the RF mount thanks to its small size. It is just a joy to use whether on the front of the bigger RF cameras like the R5 or something smaller like the Canon R8. 35mm is wide enough to capture your subject without too much distortion, isolate them thanks to that fast 1.8 aperture, whilst still capturing a lot of the background in the scene too, so it makes for a very versatile do-it-all prime lens. With just a few steps forwards and backwards, you can capture full-length shots and mid-length shots, and that wider focal length keeps you close enough to your model to communicate easily. Its maximum aperture of f1.8 means you can easily blur out busy backgrounds, especially if you get in close, meaning despite the fairly wide focal length, you get plenty of background separation. And in my opinion, bokeh is rendered nicely too. Not to L lens standards, but better than say the Canon RF 50mm 1.8. And central sharpness is actually really good too, especially considering this is one of the budget RF prime lenses. Sure, it's not up to L lens standards, but in the center it gets pretty close and renders things like eyes in amazing detail. I found it to be sharper wide open than the Nifty 50, and if you are willing to step it down to say 2.8 for example, well then at that point it is as sharp as say my Canon RF 15 to 35 f2.8 L lens. And all of the aforementioned points make this an amazing lens for weddings too. First of all, a small light lens like this is an absolute blessing on a long wedding day, but in terms of performance, the 1.8 aperture makes it pretty good in low light situations, so you can keep that ISO down. And its autofocus is fast and accurate, although it can be a little bit noisy, especially in photo mode. 35mm has become a standard among wedding photographers because of its versatility, and it generally just works whether you are indoors in a tight getting ready room or outdoors taking group photos. I love this lens for travel photography too. It is just always the one I tend to grab to accompany, say, my R6 Mark II or my Canon R8 when exploring a new city. It's small and light, of course, which is a bonus and makes for an inconspicuous setup that goes a little bit more unnoticed over something larger, like say the Canon RF 24-70. And when traveling, you generally want to maybe pick out a subject in a scene but still show off the environment, and the RF 35mm 1.8 excels at that. The lens renders really punchy colours, and for landscapes or cityscapes where you want to capture everything, just step the lens down to say f5.6 and this thing is razor sharp, edge to edge with plenty of micro contrast too, and as good as any L series lens for this use case. This lens also has macro functionality, which really opens up creative possibilities for things like product photography. Even though it's not actually true one-to-one macro functionality, it's still quite useful. And that high central sharpness is great for capturing fine details of products, whether in photo or video. So I'm just going to take a quick moment now to let you guys know about the sponsor of today's video, which is Squarespace. I've been using Squarespace long before they sponsored the channel to host and design my photography portfolio website. And for years now, it's been my go-to recommendation for any photographer or creative who needs a website. And the reason I'm always suggesting Squarespace is that you don't need any prior experience or knowledge in building or designing websites to create an amazing looking site fast. This is down to Squarespace's awesome fluid engine that makes designing and editing websites just so easy. Most of it's just a case of drag and drop, which means your website will be up and running and showcasing your work to potential clients in no time. Squarespace not only offers the best, in my opinion, customizable galleries to showcase your photography work, but if you have products to sell, whether that be physical or digital, they give you all the tools you need to get a storefront up and running fast and start selling quick. So if you're ready to dive in and start creating your perfect website, well, head on over to squarespace.com/James Reader to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain or website when using the code James Reader. All right, let's get on with the rest of the video. Speaking of video, this is one of my favorite grab and go run and gun lenses for video on the RF mount. 35mm is a classic focal length in videography thanks to its versatility. And for video, I'm not personally shooting at super wide apertures, and I'm more often than not at say f2.8 and above. And at this point, this lens is really sharp, but in my opinion, it's still not too clinical considering it is quite cheap glass. This lens is a joy to use for video thanks to its smooth, confident autofocus and that built-in lens stabilization, which will either work in tandem with your camera's IBIS for even smoother footage if you own, say, an R5, or if you own something without IBIS like a Canon R8, it provides the stabilization it lacks. Canon really do have the best built-in lens stabilization in my opinion, and it's just as good in this lens as it is in any of the L series lenses too. Also, the fact that it is small and lightweight and has that built-in lens stabilization makes it an amazing lens on a gimbal too. And of course, that fast 1.8 aperture makes it a great lens to use for low light video too. But at the end of the day, this is still a budget Canon lens, which means some compromises have been made. So let's run through a few of the cons with this RF 35mm 1.8 lens. Con number one is its autofocus, especially in video, which it's a tough one because I do like how steady and smooth the autofocus in this lens is for video. But since it's a macro lens, an issue I find is that it takes a very long time to focus, say from infinity to its minimum focus distance, since the difference between those is so vast. So if you focus on something close up at say near the minimum focus distance and then you want to snap to infinity, this lens takes a very long time to do that, and it's also very noisy as it does it, especially in video. In photo mode, it's not as bad, it's quite a bit quicker, but it's even noisier in photo mode. Con number two is that this lens has no weather sealing, and I have to be honest and say that I've used this lens quite a bit in the rain and never had any issues, but still, it is not a lens that you should rely on in adverse weather conditions. Con number three is vignette, because this lens, especially at its widest aperture, has quite a lot of darkening in the corners of the image, that takes quite a lot of correcting in post. And if you are, say, already pushing the ISO in a low light situation, then correcting these corners by brightening them is going to further decrease the image quality in the corners. But that vignette might be to your taste. Some people like it, especially for things like portraits, but still it is a con in my opinion. So that is my review of the RF 35mm 1.8. Easily one of my most recommended lenses and one of my personal favorites too. But what do you think of this lens? Do you have this lens in your collection? And if so, let me know what you think about it in the comments down below. So although not a perfect lens, it does, in my opinion, offer great image quality in a small package for a relatively good price, which makes it a no-brainer on the RF mount in my opinion. But I do still really want to see Canon release a faster RF 35mm prime lens at, say, 1.4 or 1.2 for example, and if the rumors are to believe, we can probably expect that early next year. And if that is true, I am looking forward to comparing the L series version of this lens to this one to see how they stack up next to each other. But that's it, that's the video. Thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.